The night was cold, and the air smelled of dust and sweat. The sound of boots scraping against wooden boards echoed in the crowd. Men gathered with coins in their hands, waiting for the next body to be brought forward. It was not cattle, not horses, not wagons. Tonight it was people. And in the center of it all, under the flickering light of a lantern, she stood. A young woman, trembling, her dress torn, her skin pale. Her body had not yet healed from giving birth, her steps unsteady, her breath shallow. In her arms, nothing. Her child had already been taken. She was alone, bleeding, and still they pushed her onto the stage as though she were just another item for sale. The auctioneer's voice cut through the noise, sharp and cruel. He barked out her worth as if she had none, as if her pain made her cheaper, not sacred. The crowd murmured, some laughing, some sneering. One man shouted a number, too low to even buy a mule, and the others followed with equally cruel offers. Their eyes carried no pity. To them, she was already broken, already spent. She clutched her stomach as if holding herself together, her head bent, her hair hiding her face. But even with her shame, there was dignity in the way she stood, as if some part of her still refused to bow. At the edge of the crowd, a man leaned on the rail, silent. He wore dust on his coat and lines on his face that came from years of hard living. A rancher, unknown to most, but his presence carried weight. His eyes did not follow the jokes or the jeers. They stayed on her. The world around him seemed to fade, the voices turning into a dull roar. For reasons even he could not name, something in that moment stirred. It was not desire. It was not pity. It was something deeper, harder to place. The auctioneer slammed his gavel against the block, impatient, calling for one last bid. The crowd shifted, some already turning away, certain no one would pay for her. And then slowly a hand rose. The room fell quiet. Every head turned toward the man in the worn coat, the rancher who had said nothing all night. His voice was steady, low, but it carried. The bid was made. The crowd stirred at the sound of his voice, heads turning, whispers rising like a restless wind. Some chuckled under their breath, thinking the rancher must be mad. Others narrowed their eyes, suspicious of his reasons. Why would a man spend his coin on a woman so battered, so broken, so close to death's edge? The auctioneer smirked, eager to take the bid, eager to end what had been the most pathetic sale of the night. With a slam of the gavel, it was done. She was his. The rancher stepped forward, his boots heavy against the wooden boards. The men around him shifted aside, some snickering, some muttering. Their laughter followed him, but he paid no mind. His eyes were fixed on her. She trembled as he approached, her breath shallow, her body swaying as if it might collapse at any moment. When he reached her side, he did not touch her. He simply removed his coat and draped it gently around her shoulders. The fabric hung loose, swallowing her small frame, but it gave her back some measure of dignity. She flinched at first, but when she realized there was no roughness in his hands, she stood still. The auctioneer waved them away, eager to bring up the next poor soul, and the noise of the crowd rose again. But the rancher didn't hear it. He walked her slowly down the steps, steadying her when she stumbled, never forcing, never pushing. The street outside was colder than inside, the air biting against her skin. She clutched the coat tighter, her head still bowed, eyes fixed on the dirt beneath her bare feet. His horse waited nearby, tied to a post. A sturdy animal, strong and calm, its breath rising in clouds. The rancher paused, glancing at the woman beside him. She could barely stand, let alone walk the miles to his ranch. Without a word, he untied the reins, guided the horse closer, and turned back to her. "Up," he said quietly, his voice more like a murmur than a command. She hesitated, her eyes flicking to his face for the first time. There was no cruelty there, no hunger, only a quiet steadiness. Still, she did not move. With care, he placed his hands beneath her arms, lifting her as gently as he could. She stiffened at his touch, but she was too weak to resist. He set her on the saddle, adjusting the coat around her so the wind would not steal what little warmth she had left. Then he mounted behind her, holding the reins, careful not to crowd her. The horse started forward with a slow, steady gait, hooves striking the frozen ground in a rhythm that filled the silence between them. She swayed slightly with each step, her head heavy, her body fragile. He could feel her trembling even through the coat, her strength slipping away with every passing mile. He knew she was bleeding still. He knew the journey could break her. Yet there was no other way but forward. The road stretched long under the moonlight, the land cold and empty, but he did not falter. His grip on the reins was steady, his posture strong, as though his very presence was a shield against the night. Hours passed in silence. Occasionally she shifted, as if trying to stay awake, but exhaustion dragged at her like chains. At one point she leaned slightly against him, her body too weak to hold itself upright. He did not move away. He simply adjusted his hold on the reins, allowing her to rest against his chest, the warmth of his body keeping her from the bite of the wind. When the first light of dawn touched the sky, the outline of his ranch appeared on the horizon. A modest place, built with his own hands, standing quiet against the rolling land. The barn loomed to the left, the cabin straight ahead, smoke faintly rising from the chimney where he had left a fire banked the night before. Relief tugged at him, though he showed none on his face. He urged the horse forward, and soon they were at the door. He dismounted first, then turned to lift her down. She was barely conscious, her head lolling, her lips pale. He carried her inside, his boots thudding softly against the wooden floor. The cabin smelled of ash and pine, the warmth of the fire reaching out to meet them. He laid her carefully on the bed, covering her with blankets. For a moment he stood there, looking down at her. She was not just another soul lost to the cruelty of men. She was someone who had survived long enough to reach this moment, though just barely. He moved quickly, fetching water from the jug, tearing strips of cloth, tending to her with the practiced hands of a man who had seen wounds before. He washed her brow, cleaned her arms, pressed cloth to her side where the bleeding had not yet stopped. She stirred faintly, a soft sound escaping her lips, but she did not wake. When at last he was certain she would not slip away that very night, he pulled a chair close to the bed and sat. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the only sound besides her unsteady breathing. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the woman before him. He had not planned for this, had not sought it. Yet here she was, in his home, her life in his hands. The rancher was a man who had lived years with silence as his only companion, but that silence now carried a weight it never had before. For the first time in a long while, he was not alone, and for reasons he did not yet understand. He felt the stirrings of something he thought he had buried long ago, the need to protect, not just land or cattle, but a life that had been thrown away by others. The hours after dawn stretched slow and heavy. The woman lay still under the rough wool blankets, her breathing uneven, her skin pale. Her hair clung damp to her forehead, and her lips moved faintly as if whispering words only she could hear. The rancher sat close by, his chair drawn to the bedside, his body stiff from the long ride and longer night, but he did not move. His eyes stayed on her, steady and watchful, as though his gaze alone could keep her anchored to this world. Outside, the prairie carried on as it always did. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, rattling loose boards. A crow called in the distance, its cry sharp against the silence. The sun climbed higher, spilling pale light through the single window, painting shadows across the wooden floor. But inside, time felt different, slower, fragile, balanced on the rise and fall of her chest. He thought of the crowd at the auction, their laughter still echoing faintly in his memory. He thought of the jeers, the cheap bids, the way no one had seen her as more than a burden. He had seen plenty of cruelty in his life, but something about that moment had cut deeper. Perhaps it was the way she clutched herself as though holding together what little remained of her strength. Perhaps it was the defiance hidden in her silence. Or perhaps it was simply that he had known loss himself and could not bear to see it again in another's eyes. The rancher was not a man given to many words. Years alone had taught him to keep his thoughts quiet, his heart guarded. Yet sitting there, listening to her unsteady breaths, he found his mind restless. He wondered who she was before that night, what name she carried, what dreams she once held. He wondered about the child that had been taken from her, the grief she bore along with her wounds. The questions pressed against him, but he let them rest. Answers would come when they could. For now, she needed only one thing: rest without fear. As the morning deepened, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and sharp even in their weakness. For a long moment she stared at the ceiling, her breath quickening as though unsure of where she was. Then her gaze shifted and landed on him. She tensed, her hand gripping the blanket, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. He raised his hand slowly, palms open, his voice calm. "You're safe." The words seemed strange even to his own ears, gentle, steady, spoken as though he had rehearsed them. She did not answer, but her breathing slowed. She shifted slightly on the bed, wincing at the pain in her body, then turned her face away. He did not push. He stood, fetched a tin cup of water and set it on the small table within her reach. "You need to drink," he said quietly. Her eyes flicked to the cup, then back to him. She hesitated, then reached with trembling fingers. She lifted it to her lips, spilling some as her hands shook, but she swallowed the rest. When she was finished, she set it down with effort and lay back, her chest heaving as though even that had cost her dearly. The rancher watched her, his expression unreadable, then moved to tend the fire. He added another log, the flames catching quickly, filling the cabin with warmth. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence was heavy, but not hostile. It was the silence of two people who did not yet know what to make of one another. As the day wore on, he returned to her side, checking her wounds, changing the cloths that had soaked through with blood. She stiffened each time he touched her, her eyes flashing with distrust, but she did not resist. He worked carefully, his rough hands surprisingly gentle, his movements steady and sure. When he finished, he sat back, his jaw tightening as he saw how fragile she still was. "You'll mend," he said finally. "It'll take time." She closed her eyes, her face turning toward the wall. The blanket shifted with the rise and fall of her breath. For a moment he thought she might speak, but no words came. Outside, the day stretched into evening. The rancher lit the lantern, its glow mixing with the firelight, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. He prepared a simple meal, beans, bread, and dried meat, and set a small portion beside her bed. She did not touch it at first, but later, when she thought he wasn't watching, she ate a few bites. He pretended not to notice. When the night fell again, the rancher settled into the chair by the bed, his rifle propped against the wall within reach. He had no intention of leaving her unguarded. The land was wide, and danger often traveled it in silence. Those men at the auction, he doubted they would forget her. He doubted they would forgive him for stepping in. His eyes stayed on the door, the firelight flickering across his face, as the woman drifted into uneasy sleep. For the first time in years, the cabin did not feel empty. The silence was different now, heavier, yes, but filled with something more than loneliness. It carried the weight of another life, fragile but unbroken, resting only feet away. And though he told himself again and again that he had done this out of mercy, nothing more, some part of him knew there was more to it. Something had begun the moment his hand rose in that auction hall, and now it would not be turned back. The days that followed were slow, each one carrying the weight of silence. The woman remained in the bed, her body weak but her eyes sharp, always watching, always wary. She ate little, spoke less, and when the rancher came close, her fingers curled tight around the blanket as though it were the last barrier she could hold. He did not blame her. Trust was not given easily, and he had not expected it. He simply continued as he always had, steady, quiet, moving through his tasks without fuss. He rose at dawn to tend the horses, his boots crunching on the frozen ground as the sky blushed with early light. He chopped wood, hauled water, repaired what winter winds had broken. But always when the chores were done, he returned to the cabin to her. He checked her wounds, changed the cloths, left food near her side. He never spoke more than was needed. He gave her space, though in truth, the cabin was small and the air between them felt thick with everything unsaid. At first, she met his silence with her own. She would turn her face to the wall, refusing to acknowledge him. Yet slowly, little by little, cracks began to show in her armor. One afternoon, when he placed the water beside her, her voice broke the stillness. Why? Just one word, but it carried the weight of everything she had endured. He paused, his hand resting on the cup. His eyes met hers, and for a long moment he didn't answer. Finally, he said simply, "Because no one else would." Her brow furrowed, as though the answer were too simple to be believed. She searched his face for hidden motives, for the cruelty she expected to find. But his gaze remained steady, calm, and she turned away with a faint exhale, as though unsure what to make of him. That night, when the fire burned low and she thought he slept in his chair, she whispered again, her voice barely a breath. "My baby." Her hand touched her stomach instinctively, the memory of loss pressing against her chest. He heard her, but he did not speak. His jaw tightened, his hands gripped the armrests of his chair, but he gave her the silence she seemed to need. Still, her words stayed with him long after she drifted into restless sleep. Each passing day brought a little more strength to her body. She sat up for longer, moved slowly from the bed to the chair by the fire, even managed to eat without waiting until he looked away. And with her strength, fragments of her story began to slip through. She spoke not in long tales, but in short, sharp sentences. She told him she had been sold more than once, traded like an object between men. She told him her child had been taken before she even had a chance to hold it. Her voice cracked when she said that, and she turned away, her shoulders stiff with the effort of not breaking down. The rancher listened, his expression unreadable, his hands steady as he mended a broken bridle or sharpened his knife. He did not press her with questions. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He only listened, and in his silence she found something she had not expected: understanding. But the world outside did not forget. Word traveled quickly in towns where gossip was currency, and the story of a rancher who had spent good coin on a dying woman was too strange not to spread. It reached ears it was never meant to, including those of the men who had mocked her at the auction. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of blood and gold, the rancher returned from the fields to find a sign nailed to his gatepost. A crude message scrawled across the wood: "Not yours to keep." He tore it down with one hard pull, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowing. He did not show it to her, but she noticed the way his steps grew heavier that night, the way his hand lingered near the rifle even inside the cabin. She saw the change in him, and though she said nothing, fear flickered in her eyes again. She had lived long enough to know that danger never left quietly. The next days were filled with tension. The rancher doubled his watch, riding the perimeter of his land, checking the horizon more often than before. At night, he sat awake by the fire, his rifle propped against the wall, his ears tuned to every sound outside. She pretended to sleep, but her eyes opened in the dark, following the flicker of firelight across his face, studying the lines carved deep by years of loss and solitude. She wondered what kind of man would risk himself for someone like her. She wondered what price he might one day expect. Yet despite the fear, something had shifted between them. When she moved about the cabin now, her steps no longer tried to avoid his presence. When he handed her a cup of water, her fingers brushed his without flinching. When she whispered of her baby, he did not turn away. These were small things, but they were more than she had known in a long time. One evening, as the fire crackled low, she sat in the chair near the hearth, her blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. He was at the table, mending a torn saddle strap, the steady scrape of his knife against leather filling the silence. She studied him quietly, her eyes tracing the way his hands moved with skill, the way his shoulders held strength even in stillness. Finally, her voice broke the quiet. "You lost someone too." He froze for only a moment, the knife pausing in his hand. Then he set it down slowly, his eyes lifting to hers. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of what was unsaid. At last he gave a single nod. "My wife." The words were flat, simple, but they carried a depth that filled the room. She did not press further, but she did not look away either. For the first time, their grief met in the open, unhidden, unashamed. Two people bound by loss, sitting in a cabin that smelled of smoke and pine, each carrying wounds the world had not cared to see. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and cold, the threat of men and winter both pressing close. But inside the cabin, for that moment, there was a fragile connection, thin as thread, yet stronger than either expected. The wind howled across the open prairie, carrying with it the bite of winter. The rancher pulled his coat tighter as he walked the fence line, the sky above painted in heavy gray. His land felt different now, less empty than before, but more dangerous too. He had seen the sign nailed to his gate, had read the message meant to rattle him. Whoever had left it was not finished. He knew men like that, cruel men who did not take kindly to being defied. Their pride was a weapon, and once wounded it sought blood. He could feel them circling, waiting, watching. Back at the cabin, she sat near the fire, the blanket around her shoulders, her face turned toward the window. Her body had healed enough for her to walk, though each step was still careful, cautious. She noticed how often his shadow crossed the window these days, how his hand lingered on the rifle when he came inside. She saw the lines of worry etched deeper on his face. And though he said nothing of the danger, she felt it pressing against the walls like a storm that would not stay away. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but of two people who shared something unspoken. At night, when she stirred from restless sleep, she saw him by the fire, his head bowed, his eyes heavy but never fully closed. She wondered if he ever rested, if he carried the same weight of fear that haunted her dreams. One morning, as the first snow began to fall, she spoke again. Her voice was low, almost hesitant. "You don't have to keep me here. It's only trouble." He turned from the door where he had been watching the snowfall, his hand still resting on the frame. His eyes met hers, calm but unyielding. "It's not trouble," he said, "not compared to leaving you out there." Her chest tightened at the words. She looked away, clutching the blanket tighter, unsure how to answer. For so long she had been seen as a burden, a thing to be bought, sold, or discarded. His refusal to see her that way unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. The snow thickened as days passed, covering the prairie in white, muffling the world in silence. The cabin became their whole universe. They shared meals in quiet, she at the table, he across from her, both speaking little but learning each other in glances, in the rhythm of daily tasks. He showed her how to mend small things, a torn glove, a cracked handle. And though her hands were still unsteady, she followed, grateful for something to do beyond remembering her pain. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not with the hunger she feared, but with something softer, steadier. A look that made her heart tighten in ways she did not understand. When their eyes met, she quickly turned away, her cheeks warm despite the cold. Yet some part of her did not mind his gaze. Some part of her, buried deep, longed for it. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. One night, as the fire burned low and the wind screamed against the shutters, a sound split the silence, the distant echo of hooves. The rancher's head lifted instantly, his body rigid. He moved to the door, rifle in hand, listening. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, until they circled outside the cabin. She froze in her chair, her heart pounding, her hands gripping the arms so tightly her knuckles turned white. Voices followed, muffled but sharp. Men's voices. Laughter, cruel and taunting. The rancher opened the door slowly, stepping onto the porch, his rifle steady in his hands. The cold air swept inside, carrying with it the smell of smoke and sweat. She rose, moving to the window, peering through the frost-smeared glass. 4 riders sat their horses in the snow, their eyes gleaming in the lantern light. One leaned forward, his grin wide and vicious. "You took what wasn't yours, rancher. Time to give it back." The rancher's voice was calm, but it carried through the night. "She's not yours to take." Laughter broke out among the men, harsh and mocking. "She was sold fair. You think coin makes her free. She'll never be free." Inside the cabin, her chest tightened. Their words cut deep, reopening wounds she thought had scabbed over. She pressed a hand to her stomach, steadying her breath, fighting the urge to collapse beneath the weight of memory. But then she looked at him, standing tall against the riders, his rifle unwavering, his voice steady, and something stirred in her chest. The men circled again, snow spraying from their horses' hooves. One drew his pistol, raising it slightly, his eyes cold. The rancher did not flinch. His rifle stayed trained, his body still as stone. The standoff stretched thin, the night holding its breath. Finally the leader spat into the snow, his grin fading. "This ain't finished," he growled. "You can't keep her forever." With a tug of the reins, he turned his horse, the others following. Their silhouettes vanished into the storm, their threats lingering like smoke. The rancher stepped back inside, closing the door with care. His face was calm, but his shoulders carried the weight of the encounter. He set the rifle down and glanced at her. Her eyes were wide, her hands trembling, but she stood tall, refusing to crumble. For a long moment they said nothing, only shared the silence heavy with danger, and with something deeper neither could name. She sat back down by the fire, pulling the blanket tight. He lowered himself into the chair across from her, his gaze steady on the flames. Outside, the wind roared and the snow fell thick, covering the tracks of the men who had come. Inside, the cabin held its fragile warmth. Two lives pressed closer not by choice, but by necessity, by fate, by the unyielding need to endure. The storm raged for 3 days, sealing the prairie under a blanket of snow so deep the world seemed hushed and hidden. The cabin walls creaked beneath the weight of the wind, and frost crawled along the edges of the small window panes. Inside, the fire burned almost without pause, the rancher rising again and again to feed it with wood he had split months earlier. A task he had done then without thought, now grateful for his own foresight. The woman stayed near the hearth, wrapped in wool, her face pale in the glow of the flames. At first she had sat in silence, her eyes following the dancing sparks, but by the second day she began to speak more, her words soft, uncertain, yet steady enough to fill the space between them. She told him fragments of her story, pieces that slipped through like cracks of light. She spoke of the day her child was torn from her arms, of the faces of men who had laughed while she bled, of nights where she prayed for the morning not to come. Each word was heavy, but her voice carried it as though she had carried such burdens for too long to be silenced now. The rancher listened, his face unreadable, his hands busy with quiet tasks, mending gear, whittling wood, sharpening tools. Yet though he said little, his presence was not distant. Each time her voice faltered, his steady breathing reminded her she was not speaking into emptiness. His silence was not neglect. It was strength, a ground on which she could stand. When the storm broke at last, the prairie lay under a sky as clear as glass, the snow shining in hard brilliance. The rancher stepped outside, his boots sinking deep, the cold biting at his face. He scanned the horizon, the expanse endless and white, but he knew well enough the storm had not washed away the danger. Those men would return. Their pride would not allow otherwise. He clenched his fists against the cold, his jaw tightening. He had fought the land all his life, but now he was preparing to fight men who thought themselves masters of it. Inside, she had risen from her chair and stood at the door, her hand resting on the frame as she watched him. Her body was still fragile, but her gaze was steady. She knew what he was thinking. She had lived too long among cruelty not to recognize its shadow. And yet, for the first time, she did not shrink back from the thought of standing beside someone else. That night, when the fire once again painted their faces in gold, she broke the silence with a question that seemed to hang heavier than the snow outside. "Why did you really take me from them?" The rancher looked up from the rifle he had been cleaning. His eyes met hers across the firelight, and for a long time he did not speak. At last he said quietly, "Because I couldn't leave you there, because I've buried too much already." Her throat tightened at his words, though she tried to keep her face composed. There was something in his voice, something raw, unpolished, that spoke not of mercy alone, but of loss, of a man who knew what it was to watch life be taken away. She turned her gaze to the flames, her fingers brushing the fabric of the blanket, her heart beating faster than she wanted it to. Days turned into weeks. The snow began to soften under the pale sun, the prairie waking slowly from its frozen silence. She grew stronger, her steps firmer, her voice steadier. Sometimes she helped with small chores, sweeping the cabin floor, stirring a pot, even stitching a torn shirt of his. He never asked it of her, but she did it anyway, a way of reclaiming pieces of herself. Each act felt like defiance against the men who had once treated her as less than human. Yet always, the shadow remained. One evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, smoke appeared in the distance. Not the harmless smoke of campfires, but the thick, rising plume of riders drawing near. The rancher's eyes hardened. He loaded his rifle with steady hands, his body calm though his blood ran hot. She stood near the table, her face pale, but she did not crumble. Instead, she reached for the knife he kept by the stove, her fingers tightening around the handle. When the riders arrived, their laughter cracked the still air, cruel and sharp. 4 of them again, their horses restless, their eyes fixed on the cabin. The leader leaned forward in his saddle, his voice carrying across the snow. "You can't hide her forever. She belongs to us." The rancher stepped onto the porch, his rifle steady in his hands. His voice was low, but it carried like steel. "She belongs to no one, not anymore." A tense silence followed, the kind that seems to stretch time itself. The riders shifted, their pistols glinting in the fading light. The woman inside clutched the knife tighter, her breath coming fast. For a moment, the world seemed to balance on a thin edge, ready to shatter with a single movement. Then the leader spat into the snow, his glare sharp. "You'll regret this, rancher." He turned his horse, the others following, their figures fading into the dark. The rancher lowered his rifle, his eyes lingering on the horizon long after they vanished. Inside, she stepped closer to the doorway, her face pale but resolute. For the first time, she spoke without fear in her voice. "They'll come again." He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers, steady and certain. "Then we'll be ready." The fire crackled behind them, the cabin walls holding firm against the night. Outside, the prairie lay wide and cold, but inside, something stronger had taken root. 2 lives once broken by loss, now bound together by defiance, standing against whatever storm might come next.